I wasn't supposed to be nervous that night. This wasn't my stage, it was Julia's. My wife had worked in the holding company's glass and steel empire for nearly a decade, climbing from junior designer to one of the trusted project leads under the vice president himself. She knew everyone in the room by name, had shaken most of their hands 100 times. I knew maybe half a dozen faces, all tied to contracts for my furniture workshop, jobs we'd done for their lobbies, offices, and lounges. Still, there I was, straightening my tie in the mirrored elevator as we rose to the pavilion perched at the very top of their newest tower. The place was all steel beams and transparent walls, like someone had trapped a banquet hall inside a giant crystal box. From up there, the city spread out in every direction, the river cutting a dark, twisting ribbon through it all. The glow from the bridges reflected off the glass floor panels under my feet. Julia fit right in. She wore this dark green dress that caught the light in a way I couldn't stop watching, though half the time she was turned toward someone else, smiling that perfect professional smile. She had the knack for being exactly who she needed to be in any room, which was something I admired, even envied. I, on the other hand, was the craftsman in a borrowed world. People would shake my hand politely, thank me for the oak conference table or the walnut reception desk in their office, then turn back to Julia. I didn't mind, it was her night. Dinner was a blur of conversation I didn't really follow. Talk of zoning permits, material shortages, some breakthrough in a project overseas. I sipped my wine, tried to pace myself so I wouldn't be the only one with an empty glass before dessert. Every so often Julia would touch my hand under the table. A quick squeeze, almost as if to remind me she hadn't forgotten I was there. Then came the awards. The host, a cheerful man in a midnight blue suit, strode onto the stage. His voice filled the room as he went through the categories. Best design, best sustainable build, most innovative concept. I clapped when everyone else did, even for names I didn't recognize. Then, best joint project. The big screen behind him lit up with a photo. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. It was Julia, standing on a terrace at night, framed by a skyline I recognized as ours. She was angled toward Morgan Lee, the vice president, mid-40s, sharp suit, that kind of ease you get from knowing you're one of the most important people in the room. Morgan's hand was resting low on her waist. Not casual, not fleeting. The kind of placement that says, "This person is mine, even if only in this moment." The crowd reacted instantly. Applause, whistles from somewhere in the back, a couple of teasing remarks I couldn't quite catch, and the smiles, those subtle, knowing ones, like this was some inside joke I hadn't been told. Julia laughed lightly, the same way she does when our cat knocks something over. Amused, unbothered, already moving on. She turned to the table, waved a dismissive hand. "Just part of the image," she said, her voice as smooth as the champagne in her glass. "You know how these photo ops go." People chuckled, nodding, as if she'd confirmed what they already believed, but I couldn't unsee it. I tried to focus on the next slides, the architectural renderings, the speeches, but every time I blinked, I saw his hand again. Not just where it rested, but how comfortable it looked there. Like this wasn't the first time. Like his palm knew the curve of her hip. I told myself it was nothing, that she was right. Photos can make things look like more than they are. But the knot in my chest wouldn't loosen. At one point, while the room was busy applauding another winner, I leaned toward her. "I didn't know you and Morgan did that project together," I said. She didn't even look at me. It was a cross-department thing. I was just one of the leads. Her attention stayed on the stage. "That picture. It's just a picture, Nathan," she said, cutting me off with a little smile. The kind of smile you give when you want to shut down a conversation without making it obvious. I sat back, forcing a nod. My fork scraped against the plate, louder than it should have in the lull between applause. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. People mingled, drank, laughed. Julia was in her element, moving from group to group, her hand sometimes brushing my arm when she needed to pull me into an introduction. Morgan was never far. I noticed him more now, how he'd glance toward her when she was across the room, how she seemed to straighten a little when she noticed him watching. It was subtle, so subtle that if I hadn't seen that photo, I might have missed it entirely. As the night wound down, Julia gathered her coat from the check room and looped her arm through mine. "You were quiet tonight," she said as we stepped into the elevator. "Just taking it all in," I said, keeping my voice light. She gave me a sidelong glance, as if trying to decide whether to press the point. Then the elevator chimed, and the doors opened to the lobby. The cold night air hit my face as we stepped outside. The city lights shimmered on the river, and for a moment I let myself get lost in them. But in the back of my mind, the image stayed burned into place. Julia, leaning toward another man under the glow of the skyline, his hand on her waist like it belonged there, and the room full of people who seemed to think they knew exactly what that meant. The drive home from the banquet was quiet, the kind of quiet that thins your breath and makes the dashboard clock sound louder than the engine. Julia hummed along to a song on the radio, soft and off-key, like someone trying to fill a space with anything but conversation. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 and let the night smear past the windows in red and white threads. I told myself to sleep on it, to let the image of Morgan's hand on her waist fade like a watermark. But when we pulled into the driveway and the garage light blinked to life, it only stamped the moment harder. Proof that it had happened in front of a room full of people who seemed amused by it. I lay awake and replayed not just the banquet, but the year. Little pebbles that had rolled under the door and collected into a pile I kept stepping over. I'd been busy, orders for conference tables, a run of ash shelving for a boutique, a headache with a supplier who promised kiln-dried boards and delivered bowed timber. It was easy to believe I had missed things simply because the shop demanded it. But the more I let my mind dig, the more it found. The first pebble, the late meetings. Julia had always worked hard, but these were different. They didn't follow a pattern. They sprang up at odd hours like rain clouds in a clear forecast. She'd text me at 6, running late. At 8, don't wait up. By 10, her phone would be off. Battery, she'd say, apologetic, waving the little white charger like it was proof that she meant to plug in, meant to come back to me. I believed her because I wanted to. Then came the trips. Quick day visit to field teams, she'd say, breezy as she zipped the Navy carry-on. I started glancing at the holdings project map online, the little dots showing where they were breaking ground or cutting ribbons. St. Paul, Hartford, Fresno. No dots. She went anyway, one night, sometimes two, returning with a lanyard badge, wrinkled receipts, and tired eyes. "We're exploring expansion," she'd say, kissing my cheek. Nothing concrete. I'd nod and help her unpack, folding a blouse that smelled faintly of hotel soap and something else I couldn't name. The car told its own story. We share one, a reliable gray hatchback I keep too clean by most people's standards. About 3 months before the banquet, I caught a scent in the cabin that didn't belong to either of us. Not perfume, cologne. The kind that leans dark and spicy, all cedar and ambition. It clung to the passenger seatbelt and tugged at me all the way to the lumberyard. I could taste it when I swallowed. A week later, after another late meeting, I saw a long, dark hair curled on the passenger seat. It wasn't Julia's. She keeps hers shoulder length and honey blonde, the color of summer wheat. This one was near black and too long to mistake. I plucked it off the upholstery and stood there in the garage, holding a filament of someone else's life between pinched fingers. Her phone learned new tricks. It used to live face up on the counter, the screen lighting with calendar reminders and group texts about potlucks. Now it lay face down, humming quietly like a secret. She'd answer messages in the hallway instead of the kitchen, voice dropped a notch. I'd hear the murmur of her yes and okay, and later, when I stepped into view, she'd finish quickly and tuck the phone into her sweater pocket as if it were suddenly fragile. Her conversations started to orbit the same name. "Morgan," she'd say, and the syllables would soften. "Morgan thinks we should fast-track facade approvals." Or, "Morgan says the client is nervous about the load tests." At first it made sense. He was her boss's boss, the person who could greenlight her proposals or bury them in a drawer. But somewhere along the line, the way she said his name picked up a tremor I couldn't parse. Admiration with a tiny aftertaste of fear, or maybe the other way around. She started composing herself even at home, as if every moment might be clipped into a highlight reel for someone else to watch later. She became a person who angled for the light. She'd tilt her chin when she laughed, find the sun in the room, adjust her stance to the camera I couldn't see. I told myself she cared about her career, that she was practicing the posture of someone more senior, someone ready for the next rung. I respected that. I wanted that for her. I just didn't want to be reduced to the guy dimming a lamp so she could look best in the mirror. The night after the banquet, she set her purse on the entry table and kicked off her heels with a sigh so theatrical it felt like a curtain call. "You were a hit," she said to me, which was generous, because the only thing I'd done was not spill red wine on linen. I brewed tea. She poured wine. When I mentioned the photo, lightly, like it was nothing, she rolled her eyes. "Morgan is touchy with everyone," she said. "You should see him with the city council chair. His politics." "Sure," I said and meant to leave it there, but I couldn't help myself. "You looked close." She studied me over the rim of her glass, something guarded flickering across her face. "Do you trust me?" she asked. I hated that question because it pushes you into a corner. Answer yes and you're a fool, answer no and you're an accuser. I said yes because I wasn't ready to live in a house where no felt truer. Sleep didn't come. In the dark, I took inventory. The times she'd stepped into the yard to take a call. The way her laptop started living in the home office with the door closed. The mornings she left early, traffic. Though her commute is a straight, forgiving sh*T. The new silk blouse that wasn't her style. The makeup tucked in the car visor. The playlist on her phone that skewed toward music she used to call elevator stuff. Now rebranded as helps me focus. I remembered an afternoon I dropped by her office with coffee as a surprise. The receptionist smiled and said Julia was on the terrace with the client team. Through the glass, I saw her close to a man's shoulder, laughing at something I couldn't hear. She looked like a person relieved of weight. The wind lifted her hair and I felt both proud and oddly erased. She didn't see me. I left the coffee at her desk with a note for the star and drove back to the shop, embarrassed by how eager I'd been to be part of her day. There were bright patches too, the ones that kept me from calling the pattern what it was. She'd bring pastries from a bakery near her office, sweets she knew I liked. She'd send photos from sites. A pink sunrise on scaffolding. A steel beam hoisted into place like a prayer. In those moments she was the woman I fell for. Curious, stubborn, alive. I clung to those pieces like driftwood. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the shop window, varnish-stained hands, shoulders peppered with sawdust, and wonder if I'd made myself too small. Maybe she'd grown into a world where people wore suits that fit and spoke in acronyms, and I'd stayed glued to clamps and glue-ups. It's a dangerous loop, blaming your calluses for someone else's distance. A week slid by. I filed purchase orders, milled lumber, kept the crew moving. At night we shared a bed, but not a rhythm. When she rolled toward me, I could smell hotel soap and that same shadow of cologne, like a ghost that returned whenever it pleased. I wanted to ask whose it was. I didn't. On Thursday she said she had a late prep for a pitch. I nodded, kissed her temple, and watched her taillights slide down the street. An hour later, I realized she'd left her work tablet on the kitchen island. I texted. No response. I stared at the tablet. I'm not proud of what I did next. I opened it, hoping for a simple calendar entry so I could drive it over and be useful. The calendar was spare, almost empty. The pitch wasn't there. Neither were the late meetings from the last 2 weeks. For a minute, I convinced myself she kept everything on her phone. People use multiple calendars, right? Still, the emptiness made my chest feel hollow, like I'd opened a door to a room that should be full of furniture and found dust. I set the tablet down and stood at the window, watching our street go dim. Across the way, our neighbor wrestled a stroller up the porch steps. I thought about vows and promises and the woodworking proverb older than me. Measure twice, cut once. It's supposed to prevent mistakes. It doesn't help when the thing you're measuring refuses to hold still. I didn't accuse Julia that night. I didn't accuse her any of the nights that followed. Instead, I filed the observations where I file mistakes in the shop, in a mental cabinet labeled Fix Later. But wood doesn't correct itself. Stress shows. Joints fail. A hairline crack becomes a split. Every time I told myself to let it go, I heard the dry crack of a board I'd pretended was sound. By the time the week turned, suspicion had stopped being a feeling and become a fact I wasn't ready to read aloud. The photo from the banquet didn't start anything. It only developed what had been there all along, like a latent image in a tray of chemicals. And once it appeared, I couldn't dunk it back into the dark and call it art. I had to call it what it was. The beginning of something I wasn't sure I could survive, and the end of the story I thought we were writing together. It was a Thursday when proof stopped being hypothetical. The kind of day where the rain doesn't fall, but the air feels heavy enough to press against your chest. I'd been at the workshop since dawn, cutting dovetail joints for a custom walnut cabinet. The job was ahead of schedule, so when the crew decided to knock off early, I thought I'd surprise Julia. We hadn't had a proper dinner together all week, and I had some faint hope that a quiet evening might chip away at the wall that had been growing between us since the banquet. As I turned onto our street, the first thing I noticed was the unfamiliar car parked outside our house. Sleek, black, with a shine that didn't come from my kind of hands. One of those polished machines you lease for status, not necessity. Even before I saw the plate, I knew. Morgan Lee. I'd seen him pull up to company events in this exact car. It fit him, sharp, understated, expensive without trying too hard. The sight of it sitting in front of our house felt like finding someone else's toothbrush in your bathroom. The blinds in the living room were drawn. Not unusual. Julia hated the late afternoon glare. But this time, the curtain edges didn't quite meet. From the gap, I caught flickers of movement. A shadow leaning forward. Another leaning back. Muffled voices, blurred by glass, rose and fell in tones I didn't recognize as business. Then came the laughter, soft, overlapping, the kind you can't fake in a boardroom. My stomach turned. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, the tick of cooling metal loud in the stillness. I could have called her. I could have knocked. Instead, I stepped out quietly, letting the door shut without its usual slam. The front door gave under my hand. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wine and something floral, neither of which had been here when I left that morning. They were on the couch. Julia and Morgan sat close enough that their knees touched. Her body was angled toward him, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. His hand rested casually on hers, their fingers intertwined. Between them on the coffee table sat an open bottle of wine, 2 glasses half filled. I froze in the doorway, my mind cataloging details like I was laying out evidence for an invisible jury. The faint smudge of lipstick on her glass. The navy tie draped over the arm of the couch. The way her smile, smaller than at the banquet but somehow warmer, was aimed entirely at him. Neither of them noticed me at first. Morgan was telling a story, something about a client's meltdown, and Julia laughed, her head tilting toward his shoulder. I realized then that this wasn't the guarded, careful Julia of public events. This was private Julia, the version who let her hair down, who laughed without checking if it was too loud. The version I used to think was mine alone. When she finally looked up and saw me, the shift was instant. Her smile vanished, her shoulders stiffened, and her hand jerked back from his like it had been burned. Morgan turned, his expression flickering from surprise to something I couldn't quite name. Annoyance? Calculation? Nathan, Julia said, her voice carefully neutral. You're home early. I didn't answer. My eyes went from her to him, then to the wine, then back to her. This isn't what it looks like, she added quickly, and I almost laughed at the banality of it. That line should come with a script note, delivered too late to matter. Morgan shifted in his seat, but didn't bother standing. Nathan, he said smoothly, like we were greeting each other at a cocktail mixer. We were just. I raised a hand, cutting him off without a word. I didn't need his version of events. I'd seen enough. Julia stood now, moving toward me like she could physically intercept my thoughts before they formed. It's not. This is a misunderstanding, she insisted. But there was a flush creeping up her neck, and her eyes kept darting toward Morgan as if she needed his cue. I stepped back, the threshold suddenly feeling like a line in the sand. "Enjoy your wine," I said quietly, my voice steady even as my chest felt like it was splintering. And then I left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I walked to my truck, started the engine, and drove. Downtown was buzzing with its usual Thursday crowd. People spilling out of bars, the scent of fried food and exhaust mingling in the damp air. I parked outside the business club where I knew Raymond Cole, the holdings president, was attending an industry event. Inside, the lighting was low, the air smelling faintly of old leather and single malt. I waited until Raymond was alone at the bar, swirling a drink and scanning the room for his next conversation. Then I stepped into his line of sight. "Nathan," he greeted warmly. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." I pulled out my phone, opened the photo I'd just taken of Morgan's car parked in front of my house, and slid it across the bar toward him. His brow furrowed. Then I showed him the security footage, Julia and Morgan leaving my workshop together late at night, months earlier, the lights long out. "I'm terminating my supply contract with your company," I said, my tone as even as if I were discussing delivery timelines. He looked up sharply. "Nathan, that contract's been in place for 6 years, I said, "and I'm done. I don't do business with people who treat me with contempt." I left him there, blinking, the images still glowing on his phone screen. The rain had started by the time I stepped back outside, but I didn't rush to my truck. My shirt clung to my back, my breath coming slower than I expected. I felt hollow but clear. Proof doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly in front of you. A half-empty wine glass and 2 intertwined hands under the dim light of your own living room. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I drove without music, just the thud of tires and that small rattle in the dash I kept meaning to fix. By the time I reached the river, my hands had steadied. The city moved on like nothing had happened while my life split down the center like a plank under too much load. I called no one. When I could breathe without tasting copper, I pointed the truck toward downtown. Raymond Cole's private club sits near the courthouse. Brick, brass plaque, a doorman built out of patience. I wasn't a member, but last year I delivered a bar cart to their lounge and the staff remembered the guy who argued about casters. Inside it smelled like leather and citrus oil. Soft music, harder talk. I found Raymond at the far end of the bar staring into a honey-colored drink. He turned when I said his name. "Nathan, you're out late." "So are you." I set my phone on the walnut and tapped the screen. The photo of Morgan's car outside my house glowed between us. Raymond's face didn't move, but his fingers tightened on the glass. I swiped to the time-stamped clip from my workshop camera. Julia and Morgan emerging past midnight, heads down, moving like people used to the dark. "This is none of my business," he tried. "Personal matters." "This is business," I said. 6 years I've built for your company. Lobbies, boardrooms, the tables your negotiations rest on. Effective immediately, my shop is out. Pull our name off pending invoices. The oak for your executive floor can find another home. He looked at me like I'd announced a flood. "Nathan, be reasonable. We're weeks from install. We rely on your team. What happened with Lee and—" He paused, searching for a safe word. "Don't burn down a partnership over something you'll regret in the morning." Regret had left hours ago. "I won't provide for people who treat me with contempt." I heard how steady I sounded and knew that steadiness was the only tool I had left. Raymond set the glass down, the soft click louder than it should have been. "What do you want me to do? Fire a vice president because your wife made a mistake?" I wasn't there to fix his org chart. "Do what you like," I said. "Do it without my work." He pinched the bridge of his nose, asked me to sit, to talk it through. I rose instead. "The cancellation letter will be in your inbox before sunrise. You'll get a credit for materials I haven't cut. The rest is yours to solve." On my way out, the maitre d' gave me the 2-finger salute he reserves for members. I nodded back and stepped into the rain. My phone buzzed. 2 messages from Julia. One from an unknown number I didn't need to open to know was Morgan. I turned the device face down on the passenger seat and drove. Back home, the house was lit like someone had been waving their arms for help. I walked past the living room without looking and went straight to the bedroom. The suitcase came down from the closet with a dusty sigh. I packed like for a job out of town. Jeans, work shirts, the heavy sweater with epoxy on the cuff. I couldn't sleep in that bed, not with the heat of their voices still in the walls. I left a note on the kitchen island because I refused to disappear like the guilty one. I know. I've ended the contract. I'll be at the shop. We will speak when I'm ready. I signed my name the way I do on finished pieces. Sharp, deliberate, no flourish. At the workshop, the air was sweet with sawdust and linseed oil. The clock over the office door read 1:13 a.m. I turned on the task lights one by one. Little moons over benches scarred with years of mistakes and victories. Work makes grief obey for a while. I planed a board that didn't need planing. I sharpened chisels already sharp. When the blade kissed the strop, it made a soft hiss. Control, distilled. Somewhere around 3, the harder decision arrived. I drafted the termination. Cause, dates, legalese I'd learned out of necessity. I wrote the email to my crew, scheduled for 7 a.m., telling them the install was off and that I'd make payroll from reserves until we pivoted. I apologized without saying why. They didn't need to walk through my private wreckage to know the course had changed. But the first strike wasn't the cancellation. It was the call to the only person I knew who hates gossip more than waste. Victor Alvarez, partner at a small investment fund that keeps a finger on the pulse of companies like Julia's. We'd done quiet favors for each other. Rush builds for his firms, introductions to clients who pay on time. He answered on the second ring, voice gravelly with sleep. "Hale, sorry to wake you," I said. "I've got information you shouldn't ignore." I told him what I knew firsthand. Payment delays over the last 2 quarters. Excuses that changed shape every week. Purchase orders split to dodge approvals. I told him what I suspected. The holding was carrying more short-term debt than their posture suggested, and a vice president was about to star in a scandal that would outrun any press release. I didn't embellish. Victor listened the way cabinet makers listen to grain, waiting for the line to tell him where to go. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure of what I've seen. Sure enough of the rest to risk saying it aloud." "Send me documentation," he said. "Late pay logs, bounced remittance, vendor threads. If it checks, there'll be a list in the morning. I can't promise how loud it gets." "You don't have to," I said. "It will be loud enough." After I hung up, dawn was still a rumor at the edge of the sky. I printed the cancellation letter, signed it, scanned it, sent it. Then I wrote Julia an email instead of a text because emails make people sit up straighter. "Julia, Morgan was in our home tonight. I saw enough to stop pretending. I've terminated the contract with your company. Tomorrow, the consequences of your team's choices, financial and otherwise, will begin to land. My goal isn't revenge. It's dignity. I won't subsidize contempt. When you're ready to speak honestly, you know where the shop is. Nathan." It was the most measured thing I'd ever written in anger. I sent it before I could blunt the edges. Outside, the rain eased. The alley behind the shop began to silver with morning. I brewed coffee in the dented kettle that looks like it survived a small war and carried the mug to the front door. Across the street, the baker flipped on his lights. We waved at each other like men who had been awake too long. By 7, my crew's replies landed. Confused, supportive. A few swears tucked between promises to adjust. By 8, Victor texted a link. A pre-market note naming the holding among firms with frozen lines and sudden scrutiny. I set the phone down and listened to the shop wake up. The thrum of the dust collector, the click of the compressor, the whisper of belt sanders eating the edges clean. People say don't decide while angry. Maybe that's true most days. But some choices only happen when the heat burns off everything ornamental and leaves you with the grain of who you are. Mine was simple. Stop building tables for men who would set their glasses on my life and call it networking. Put my name where I can stand to see it. By noon, a competitor called asking if I could quote a rush job. I looked at the blank space where the holding schedule used to dominate my week and said yes. That was the first strike. Not fury, not shouting, but the refusal to keep supplying a stage for my own humiliation. I didn't knock over the structure. I just removed the beams I had been providing and let gravity take the L.